Welcome to Stories in Focus. My name is Ellouise Schoettler. I'm a storyteller, but today I'm a host. And I'm really happy for the guest that we have with us today, Kate Campbell Stevenson, who lives right here in Silver Spring in Montgomery County. But she's a performer, nationally performer, and has a specialty in the history of women. Kate, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me, Ellouise.
Well, it's not that we don't know each other.
That's right. But it's great to be here.
It's another chance to talk. You know, and I've wanted for a long time. Kate has a long history and a really powerful involvement with the Women's Heritage Center in Baltimore. So we're going to start our conversation today talking about that so that she can bring you up, you know, with what they do over there, what their plans are, and what they want to do. How long have you been on their board?
I actually just came on their board this past year, but I've been associated with them as their cultural ambassador for about 10 years. So,
yeah, what attracted you to go over there?
well, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center focuses on Maryland women, adding her story to history to tell our story.
Great.
And it's exciting because it's important to get these stories recorded and to get them disseminated and have people know about all the dynamic, incredible women that have been active in Maryland and continue to be so, whether it's from history or whether it's present, and it's to inspire the future.
Well, I think it's so necessary, you know, and we don't have our history so many times, and especially when you're looking at a state, you know, that you may lose people that you'd really want to know about in that situation. I've been over to the Heritage Center. You know, you're looking for a new space right now, so I really know you through the old space about a year ago. And I've seen the exhibit. Do you have a name for that exhibit, and what's your purpose there?
We have many exhibits. We've got the Women in Science and Women of Goddard exhibit that we put together a wonderful book about. And then we also have the Expressions, Women in the Arts, and that is a traveling exhibit. We had that at the space, and then when we had to move out, we were able to stay in this space free for about 7 years, which was 5 years longer than we anticipated, which is great.
Yeah.
Now we're looking for a new space, and we're honing in on a few possibilities. But that exhibit we deliberately produced to be portable and traveling. So now it's traveling all over the state, and it highlights women in the arts, mostly the contemporary women of the arts, women that have made a difference or are making a difference, or from Maryland, or are like Goldie Hawn and so on, or women who are actively participating in the arts now. Whether they're educators or performers, I happen to be in it. Which
I
is
was going to
nice.
say you are yourself.
Yeah, I was very flattered that they wanted to include me.
As a performer, what do you do when you perform?
I use.
I know, but she should tell you.
I use music, drama, sign language, poetry, and I create a series of one-woman shows. I bring to life historical American women, and I bring them to life with on-stage makeup and costume changes.
It's fascinating. You ought to go to see it when she does it.
And it's exciting because most of these women, some of them are well known, like say Eleanor Roosevelt, but many are not. And it brings these women's stories, which are very impactful, very inspiring, and many of them are unknown. To have them realize that there are women's stories everywhere that need to be preserved and to be disseminated and to be shared.
Well, you know, it's funny because over the weekend, I was distracted from some work I'm supposed to be doing because they came on Hidden Figures.
Oh, yes.
And I've seen that several times, but I took the time to watch it again, and I was absolutely charmed by it and inspired by it. And it's the story of the African American women who worked for NASA. Yes. And it was a total secret. And they were brilliant, and they made contributions to getting John Glenn up into the skies and doing his...
Continuing, and Katherine Johnson, who was a big part of it, she was very big in the moon Apollo programs,
right,
too.
Right, And so you just felt so good about that. So you're getting that out of this whole... That's your mission, isn't it?
Absolutely.
How do you speak of that? If you're going into a school to tell somebody about it, what do you talk about your mission?
Well, it ties right in with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center to add her story to history, his story, to tell our story, that women have been there all along, and they're powerful, but they weren't writing the history books. And so they really weren't even in the history books. And even today, we have the same maybe 10 women in the history books that were in when I was a child.
Right.
And
that's because they can't find any more, right?
So, I mean, it's a big, big mission to say, hey, maybe even people in my family history, and I encourage them to go home and talk to their parents and ask them questions. What did they do during one of the wars, or what did their grandparents do? How did you deal with the challenges that came in your life, and how did you solve the problems? Because it's all about problem solving, and women are excellent problem solvers.
Yeah, they are. They are. They are. That's what I've loved about the storytelling that I do, because I work with women also. One of the things I saw you do at the National Women's History House, the Alice Paul House, I've always called it. They have a new name for it now, but I've always called it the Alice Paul House. And tell us just a thread about your relative that you did find.
Oh.
And you tell
you
her.
came to that show. There's so many that I run together. But I have a relative named Louise Boyd, who led not one, not two, but 7 Arctic expeditions in the 1920s and the 1930s. 7 Arctic expeditions. But nobody knows about her. And she mapped out the floor of the North Atlantic and surveyed and mapped out the east coast fjords of Greenland. She discovered a huge undersea mountain bank, which, if you're a submarine or in a submarine, you'd want to know about. Right. And her work was very valuable to the United States military in World War II.
Oh, sure.
And yet, nothing is ever mentioned about her in any. You have to go to the National Archives and dig to find anything. And I did. And so now I'm excited to talk about her story. And she's included in my Women in STEM program that I take around the country. And it's STEAM because I use the arts to tell the stories. And it's very, very important. But Louise Boyd is quite an amazing story, and I want it out there. I'd love to make a documentary about her, but that's a whole nother thing. But these kinds of stories are so important to be role models for our young women students, our young girls, and also for our young boys to understand that women have been there all along,
right,
active.
Well, there's where my daughter came in and we sat down and we were watching the movie. She had also seen it a couple of times. We had seen it in the theater and then we'd seen it on television. And of course, during the period of time when they were working on the space, they were really taking the rockets. Shepard did his little launch, and then they had another one before John Glenn did the pass around. And Jim was in the Air Force at that time. He was a doctor. He was in the Air Force at the Air Medical School down in San Antonio, Texas. And I was sitting there. He was working with a lot of these guys and what they were studying and everything. And I thought, I thought that I had heard a lot about it and everything, but I said to Karen, I said, your dad was in the Air Force at that time. This was a lot that he worked in, not in the numbers stuff and et cetera. I said, but they were never mentioned.
No, and not until just recently.
That's right. They were never mentioned. And yet the one of the women, makes the difference between how they could make a change in the rotation for Glenn's shoot.
He wasn't going to go.
No, he wanted.
Unless
Where's the girl?
Catherine, the girl.
Where's the
Catherine
girl?
Johnson would check all of the information
Yeah.
before he actually would say, "Okay, I'll leave." And
Yeah, it's thrilling.
it was an African American woman that
Yes.
made the difference.
Yes, who didn't even have a bathroom in her building. There were so many things that whoever wrote the script put some things in it that really forced you. And as somebody that was living through that on a sideline, way on a sideline, but at least I knew what was going on. And or maybe I didn't know what was going on, I don't know. But I know that they were never mentioned.
Right.
And that's just not acceptable.
No, it's not. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, and the Maryland Women's Heritage Center is really concentrating on transmitting these stories throughout the state. Even we serve as a beacon, really, for to all the states about our center. Because it's not a museum, it's an active learning center that we incorporate all the areas of our state, the Eastern Shore, Western Maryland, down in near suburban DC in Maryland, and Baltimore, all the areas of Maryland. We collect and share incredible women's stories that people understand. Women are dynamic beings that are changing the world.
Yeah, and that they don't. In my life, I have a quick story about that and about finding a woman. And because I know you, because I know what you do, that we talked about a project that now we're working on together. In 1954, I entered Johns Hopkins nursing school. And I came up from North Carolina. I wanted to be a nurse, and I was there. However, I did leave nursing because I had found my prince. And in those days, in 1954, it was easier to get married than it was to keep trying to slug it out. The main thing that struck me is I started working about the story of the 64 Hopkins nurses that went to France as part of a hospital during World War I. And one day I'm reading more of the stuff in the development, and I realized that I was 18 years old when I went there. And in the front lobby, where you could sit or you had to walk through, there was a plaque on the wall in that reception area that talked about the hospital in France. It didn't name the nurses, but it pointed to them. So I never asked anybody about that. I didn't. And yet now that I've was working it up and preparing the script, I realized that there would have been women, older women, working at Hopkins Hospital at that time who had been to France. They never spoke about them. I never thought of sitting down with an older woman to have a conversation or ask them, what did you do? What did you know anything about that? And it made me feel guilty. It made me feel darn guilty. So that's how I really am devoted to letting people in the state of Maryland know about these women, and nobody does. I've carried it all across the state, but now, thanks to the Women's Heritage Center, we're doing something about that. And let's wait and don't go away, because I want you to hear what Kate and I have taken to the top and what's going to happen for the nurses from Johns Hopkins. We'll be right back.
People think I'm trash, but but they're all. Today I'm just an aluminum can, but one day I could be a stadium.
I know you're back. You're dying to know, aren't you? What are we going to do to honor 64 Maryland women who went to France? What shall we say?
Well, I'm so excited about it because when you started telling me about the story of Bessie Baker and these 64 women who went over, we need to recognize them.
Yes.
They were in Maryland.
Yes, yes.
So you mentioned you'd like to have a plaque. And I thought, well, this is exactly what we do. We commemorate Maryland women who are making a difference or who have made a difference. And let's think about this. These were not all young nurses, but they were nurses of all ages that went over. And this was the breaking new ground, new territory, really.
Well, it was. And the thing about it is the age that were accepted when they recruited for them. Now, some of you may not know this, is that the Red Cross and the Army worked together in 1916, before we had entered the war, to prepare for what they would have to have overseas, which would be a hospital for every group that came. So they recruited nurses from hospitals all over the country. And Hopkins agreed that they would have one. Harvard had one. You know, they had the New York hospitals have it. There was just Missouri, all over, they had them together. And the way they did this was the women joined the Red Cross. As soon as their feet touched France, once we were in the war, they were in the Army. So they were Army nurses. In my mind, these women from Hopkins that we're talking about, that you're going to give the plaque to honor them for what they did, and Hopkins for joining and being there, is that they represent all those nurses that went over, you know. And maybe what we'll see out of this is that more hospitals will do something to recognize their nurses.
And this is 100 years.
100 years ago.
Ago, long overdue that they're recognized for their incredibly brave efforts. I mean, they were at risk when they were over there.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. They went over 12 days on a ship. They were, you know, there were submarines underneath them. There was all that going on. And they landed in late June. And then they went to a makeshift place, Bezoils, France, over to the east. And what happened was in November, Miriam Knowles, who was the youngest one of the nurses, died. And it was so devastating that everybody was really very upset with this. She got pneumonia. Nobody realized what was going on. They were under a lot of strife with the patients that were coming in, and that happened. How do I happen to know this? Because the Library of Congress had 57 letters written from those nurses that are down there. And so the script is really drawn from their words, but being told to the audience by one person who doesn't have a name.
But it's so exciting to work with primary resources and
right.
original documents, and to know that you can get the story straight, and that many of the things coming from their words, how they felt, how they reacted, and dealing with the pressures and the cold. I know the weather was, they were freezing over there.
It was one of the worst winters. There were 2 winters, one of the worst winters that they've ever had there. They didn't have enough heat, you know, in the dormitories where they were. There are just many personal things. And so when I went for the story, one of the things that I think we all look for, you talk about it in a number of your stories, is we don't know the personal life that the woman was leading. You know, in other words, the food wasn't always great. The heavy clothing didn't come as quickly as it should have. You know, there were just all of these things. But the big problem, they had no rank.
Yeah.
They were in the Army, but they had no rank, which means that that was a big problem for them. Big problem. There's so much more, but what I really loved about Bessie Baker, you know, and I know that you do this with your own work. You can hear it in you when you're talking about it. I love her.
She's amazing.
Well, you can't read the letters, you can't read what other people are saying, and then what she said, but at the end of the war, they had a Thanksgiving dinner afterwards so that they could all be together one more time. And at the end, she said, I have something to say. And she said, I know when I go home, people are going to ask me, what does an Army nurse look like? And I know what I'm going to say. I'll think of you. And she looked around to all of these women, and she said, there'll be blue-lipped women that stood so close to a pot-bellied French stove that was glowing red just so that they could keep warm. But they never stopped their work. They did the best that they could. So I think that's what we find out.
Well, they're true heroines.
Yes, yes.
And proving that through all of the challenges, they still kept their focus, and they were contributing and helping and saving lives and making a difference. And that's why their stories are so wonderful. People today have challenges and frustrations, and I always remind them through my programming. I said, well, take for instance if Bessie Coleman, who was black female, from a poor family in the early 1900s, and it was there was all this discrimination. If she can learn how to fly, then we have no excuses today that there have,
right.
you know, so we can use their stories through the women you're talking about today, with Bessie Baker and her women nurses. And Bessie's leadership was so important.
Yeah.
And how she comported herself and how she encouraged people and could truly understand the challenges that these women were under. That's how we can inspire everyday people today to work through their barriers and obstacles, to reach for their goals.
Right. Well, and then after we had talked about it, and you had called me and said that the Maryland
Women's Heritage Center.
Yeah,
Maryland Women's Heritage Center.
I'll go home and practice. But that they would like to be the one that gave the plaque. And I went to the dean, Patricia Davidson, at Hopkins, and they welcomed it. And in fact, they are putting on the small reception, which, you know, will come.
And it's wonderful to have partnership and to, and to understand that working together, we can make even a bigger, stronger impact, and also help to get the message out.
Yes, yes, yes.
About not only will there be this plaque, but we want to get their story out as well.
Yes.
I know you're doing it nationally, but here at the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, we'll be able to focus on Bessie Baker as well.
Well, you and I are going to her grave.
Yes, we are.
Yes, and we'll have the pictures of that. And that, to me, is when you're working on a program and you feel like you've come to know them, you know, that when you can go that far, go to the grave and say hello, leave a flower or what, then you've established a relationship. And who knows, someone else may go back there. And I think that when I first talked to Dean Davidson about that story and about what we wanted to do and whatever, she wants her students over there to know about it. And today, it's hard to keep up a busy school, to do all these other things, and with all the work that the students, you know, are doing, they don't know.
No, they don't know, and they need to know the historic value of what the profession that they're going into.
Yeah. Well, those nurses from over there went over to do their job, but when they came back, they had seen so much, no rank, no this, no that, that they really were a strong force in strengthening the profession of nursing for women. And you see this now. The thing that I think is funny, I'm originally from North Carolina, and that in 1930, 29 and 30, Duke University wanted to start a nursing school. And Bessie Baker had continued her nursing career by going to more universities and whatever for her own education, and she was known as a nursing educator, and they hired her to establish Duke University Nursing School, so which is totally successful in and of itself these days. So they too will welcome the story. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we keep telling these stories for. Mm-hmm.
Truly, to learn from them, and how she persevered in this profession,
absolutely.
And look what she went on to do. So it shows the options. It shows that hard work can pay off.
Yeah.
And what's to stop them? I mean, the women of today. Hey, I can make a difference.
Yeah, nothing. So we just want you to know about it here in Maryland. It's something for us to be proud of, that we have a Women's Heritage Center in Baltimore that would bring these people, and that you have the exhibits.
We have many exhibits.
What's your favorite?
Well, I love
Who's
the women
your
in
favorite
STEM.
women?
I love the women in STEM. I personally know a lot of the women from NASA Goddard. I've gotten to know them through my work with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and produced some, with the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, been involved in some wonderful intergenerational events with the women of Goddard, the women scientists of Goddard, working with young students who have come into the center. And also the center goes to NASA Goddard, and we also work on programs there. So I love the women in STEM. The women in the arts is wonderful because it's expressions of all different kinds of art. You know, we can have theater arts, we've got writing, we've got the photography, we've got the drawing and the painting, and there are so many ways to creatively express yourself, and the arts are so important.
Yeah.
And that's what I do, and I feel truly called to do it. I think the arts is another way to actually reach people at a deeper level.
Right.
And that's where the inspiration comes from. Instead of somebody just standing up and talking, it's through the music, it's through the beautiful words that have been poetry, or through beautiful photographs or whatever. It can reach so many different people to inspire them. And so I love the Women in the Arts. I love the Unsung Heroes exhibit.
Oh, yeah.
Because anybody can write into and set up a story about women from Maryland that have made a difference to them, whether it's their mother, their grandmother, a teacher, a next-door neighbor who made a huge impact on their lives.
Is that a timely thing, or do you look at the website? Or how
Yes,
do,
you
how
can go
do
to
people
you can
find
go to
out
the
about-
website, and I'm sure you'll put that up on the screen here. But the website, we have a lot of that information up on our website, the Women in the Arts and the STEM exhibit, and you can actually go in and read each woman's story that's featured in these exhibits. And we also house the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame, and those women go all the way back to before we actually were a state, to when we were just a territory, to present day women. So I'm hoping that you'll put Bessie Baker's story, or a nomination in for the Maryland Women's Hall of Fame.
Absolutely,
And
because you need to know her.
Yes, we do. And so that's a wonderful exhibit that we have. So we can't wait to get a new permanent location. But until that time, the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, we partner with people all over the state. We just did an incredible event with the League of Women Voters, and so we go over and we partner, and I think that's what's a great way to get the stories out.
It is, Kate, and thank you for coming. This is something that you can look for in the notifications in the paper or whatever. We just need to find out what our history really is. Thank you for coming.
You are welcome.
Come back. We'll figure out more things to tell you about what's happened in Maryland with women. Thank you very much.